With the help of Hashem, we are learning Beitzah Daf Chof Ches. We left off on Daf Chof Ches, Daf Koyach, Amud Aleph, all the way on top of the Amud by the Mishnah. We're going to be learning today about Uvda B'Choil, mundane activity, connected to the sugya that we began regarding making sales on Yom Tov, that as long as money is not exchanged, more importantly, as long as the mention of money is not there, then one is allowed to purchase on Yom Tov. After Yom Tov, the seller and the buyer will come to an understanding of how much money is owed. In that context, we're going to learn that the scale, the balancing scale that is normally used while selling meat may not be used on Yom Tov, as we will see, because it's Uvda D'Choil. It looks like a very mundane activity. We're going to learn about other activities, other things that were done. For example, handles used to be made in the meat. They used to use an instrument to cut out a handle in the meat for the buyer to be able to walk out holding the meat itself. That's something that may also not be done on Yom Tov, and things that are of the like. We're going to learn about sharpening knives, the chalif, the shchita knife, that may not be done on Yom Tov. And that's already really connected to the machlokas that we will learn on Daf Chof Ches between Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Everyone agrees that food preparation, everything that is needed for food preparation from kneading onwards, is allowed to be done on Yom Tov. However, that which falls into the category of machshirei oichel nefesh, which means the preliminary activities that are done in order for food to be prepared. For example, sharpening a knife, that's not food, but in order to shech, you have to sharpen the knife. That's really subject to the machlokes, Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim, whether one is allowed to even violate that which otherwise would be a malacha for machshirei oichel nefesh or not. We're going to have a case where the Gemara is going to speak about halacha be'ein moedin kain, that there are certain things that halacha is a certain way, but we don't paskin that way. We're going to learn how Rashi interprets it, and based on Daf Chof Ches, on today's Daf, we're going to see the source of the Alter Rebbe's understanding of halacha be'ein moedin kain. We're going to learn about the concept of tircha yisera. We're going to learn about the concept of tircha deloi sarich. These are all very challenging concepts, not in concept, but applying, just like what is Uvda D'Chol. What is Uvda D'Chol is very difficult to apply. What is mundane activity? What's not mundane activity? What's considered excessive work? Tircha Yeseda. What's not considered excessive work? What's considered unnecessary exertion? Unnecessary tircha and not. At least people have scenarios that we will use in halacha as our sources to better understand how we can apply them to modern day scenarios and much more. And Chevra, let us start on Daf Chof Ches, again, Amud Aleph, all the way on top of the Mishnah. So after mentioning on Daf Chof Zayin Amud Beis, that as long as money is not mentioned during a sale, one is allowed to sell food on Yom Tov for Yom Tov needs. So in that context, says the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, that even though putting meat in a scale is not permitted, Rashi writes, because it's ma'asechoil, or as we call it, uvda d'choil, which means it's mundane activity. But on the other hand, you want to know exactly how much meat is being sold, how much meat is being bought. We're speaking about a counterweight scale. So normally you would place a stone that would weigh a pound, a kilo, or any other weight that society is using. Over here, to make a shinui, to deviate, to do something different, which will thus allow us to do something that otherwise would be classified as Uvda D'Choil, says Rabbi Yehuda, Shoikel Adam Basar Keneged Akli, on one side of the scale put a meat, and the counterweight should be a vessel, or Keneged Akupitz, put some sort of meat cleaver, which is something which is ordinarily never used as a counterweight. But this will help the seller and the buyer know how much meat was sold. And after Yom Tov, they can weigh that kupitz, they can weigh the cleaver, they can know exactly how much it weighed, and they'll know how much meat was sold, and they'll know how much money is owed. In other words, just changing the ordinary manner of using a weight, a counterbalance weight, is allowed according to Rabbi Yehuda. However, the Chachamim disagree. They are more stringent with the concept of uvda d'choil. It's a mundane activity. Ein mashgichin bekaf maznaim kol ikar, which means we may not use a scale at all. I don't care what you put on the counterweight. A weight may not be used. Now, really, in Yerushalmi, in Gemara Yerushalmi, the Gemara tells us that this statement of the Chachamim is only regarding a vendor. But in one's home, one is allowed to use a counterweight scale if the person who's cooking the food wants to know exactly how much meat they're putting into the pot. It's mashma from the Babli that is also not allowed, as we'll see in a few lines. And the Gemara actually begins by pointing out that really all the Chachamim needed to say is ein mashgichin b'kaf maznayim. Don't use it at all. And we will understand that they're not allowing you to put in the countermeasure, not a vessel, not a cleaver. Why did the Chachamim add the words kol ikir? Not at all. It's mamish extra words. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. That's to teach you afilu l'shomrei minhu achbarim. If you are putting meat in the scale, not because you're selling it, you simply want to protect it from mice or from rodents. So you want to put it on a place that's up on high. Even that is not allowed. And Bikan say many of the Achreinim mashma that even in your home, you may not use this counter scale. In other words, not like Li Yerushalmi, because if in your home you can use it, why can't you put it to save it from the mice? You can't use it at all. The who, when may it not be used? The Talia Bisadita, only if it's hanging from the ring, only if it's hanging high above. If you have this utensil with the counterweights, but it's laying on a table or laying on the ground, no one ever uses that scale to know how much meat you have when it's laying on something. It only functions when it's hanging from a ring. So then even the Chachamim will agree that if for whatever reason you want to put something in either of the pans of the sides, then you are allowed to do it. But Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, more about uvda d'choil. Kabach uman, a professional butcher. Asur lishkol basar biyad, may not use his hands to determine how much meat is being sold, as Rashi explains, 5 lines from the top, that a butcher would take the measure, the pound, the kilo, whatever he would use to put in the counterweight, and he would put in the other hand. Now, Kavan's picture is not good because that's meat and meat. He's speaking not about meat against meat, but he's speaking about a stone, a weight against meat. And he would somehow know, the meat in my right hand is exactly the weight of the pound stone in my left hand. That's something that, since a professional butcher, Taka, gets it correct, he also may not do it on Yom Tov. And finally, another type of uvda d'choil that may not be done on Yom Tov, Tabachum, and a professional butcher, asur lishkol basar b'mayim, may not ascertain how much the meat weighs. They would have certain cups that would have measuring lines, and water was put in it. And then when you would add in meat, the water would rise, and from the displacement of the water, you would know exactly how much meat is in that cup. That was another medium through which they would ascertain weight. None of that is allowed to be done. All of this points out that indeed the sale will be only approximation. They won't even know exactly how much was sold, even though we'll learn other techniques that will help a buyer buy a meat on Yom Tov without them putting anything on Yom Tov in a way. But we're going to do the best we could not to violate any laws and to know better how much exactly was sold. For after Yom Tov, for the value that's going to be paid, should be more precise. Another uvda d'choil activity. Today we have bags. Actually, today bags are becoming a big issue. Plastic bags are almost asur. Then they had no bags. So if the buyer didn't have a utensil, what did the butcher do? He would use a knife, special knife, and he would cut in the meat a hole, and that was used by the purchaser as a handle to walk out with the meat. That may not be done. Interesting. Okay. However, ubiyada, but if the butcher is going to make the hole, the handle, not by using a utensil, but with the butcher's hand, with the butcher's fingers. In other words, it's going to be a shinoi. He's going to do it in an unusual way. That's already so far removed. It's not called uvda d'chayil. Amar Afuna, from the inyan le'inyan. If you remember that there's something unique about meat, basar, shenasalami, and ha'ayim, if you have meat, that's kosher, but it was not observed. There is a fear that maybe an animal brought meat from elsewhere that's not kosher, took your kosher meat. Maybe the meat that's in front of you was not the meat that was there before. And the solution for that nowadays is that the meat is, so to say, double wrapped or double sealed. We learned that sugya and chulin. Other people made a siman. They made some sort of identifying mark in the meat. So says Rafuna, mutar lasi siman bebasar. You are allowed to make this mark on the meat on Yom Tov. That's not called uvda d'chol. That's necessary. If you're not going to do this, then if it's going to be transported without it being observed by a yid, then the recipient won't be even allowed to eat it. And that he would always cut his meat in a triangular, which is a very unusual way of cutting meat. And his household members knew only to eat meat if it came in that shape. And that is something that's allowed to be done on Yom Tov. Says the Gemara story. Now, to appreciate the story, we have to remember that the Rabbi Chia, the great Rabbi Chia, was a Talmud of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. And that's Negeya. Rabbi Chia and Rab Shimon Berebi, the son of Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rab Shimon, they shoiklin mother keneged mana b'Yom Tov. That was the picture that Kevin put before. There was meat that the Rebbe had. Rebbe was giving it to both of them. Each one, so to say, was gonna try to take the correct half amount. How do you know exactly half? And it's about the weight. It's not about the size. So they would put one half in one hand and one half in the other hand, and they would more or less feel that it's the same, and that was allowed. And the Gemara challenges, come on, who are they following? I have a problem. Not like Rabbi Yehuda, and certainly not like the Rabbanan of our Mishnah. Ik Rabbi Yehuda, Amar, Shoikel Adam Basa Keneged Akli, Keneged Akupitz. He only allowed for you to use something that is in the weekdays never used. That's a vessel in the countermeasure, a cleaver, a Keneged Clean, but Keneged Midachlina Noi, because even during the week, it's more common for people to weigh meat against wheat. It's more similar to mundane activity. And if you follow the Rabbanan, even worse. You can't use a counterweight measure at all. And should that not include also hands? So the Gemara says, you're right. If you only would have learned our Mishnah, then we wouldn't understand who they were following. But there is another Tana, and that's the rule in Torah Shabbat Peh. The Chazal say very often that Divrei Torah aniyim b'makam echad, ashirim b'makam acher. When you learn one sugya, don't think you covered all of the opinions. Some of it was purposefully. Some opinions are quoted elsewhere. There is a sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, which is more lenient than both shitas of our Mishnah. The Tanya, Rabbi Yeshua Omer, Shoiklin Mana, Keneged Mana b'Yom Tov. They're even more lenient than Rabbi Yehuda. They also hold you may not use a proper counterbalance weight and putting in a pound or a kilo that you may not use. But as long as you're not using the proper stone, any deviation is good enough. Now comes along Rabbi Yosef and he says a chiddush that halach is Rabbi Yeshua. Now, why am I saying halach is Rabbi Yeshua? Because since in the Sechta B'Chodesh, as we'll explain in a moment, there is a Mishnah that's written anonymously. And l'chu'ura, that Mishnah is only following the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, even though it's a real link, it's a jump, but we're making the jump. That's the way Rebbe is telling you halacha ki Rabbi Yeshua. Now, what's the Mishnah in B'Chodesh? That's a stam Mishnah that the Havamina is only going to be following the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua. So we have to remember that any animal that was consecrated to go on the altar is imbued with such a high level of holiness that even when it becomes disqualified, thus called psulei hamikdashim, there is a vestige of kedusha that remains in the animal. And in most cases, other than in the B'chayr and the Meiser Behema, even after you redeem it, after it's blemished, of course, after it's puzzled, you may not share the animal, you may not work with the animal, and you may not do other activities, theoretically, that are going to treat the meat like ordinary meat, even though now it's fully redeemed. Now, one of the questions is, when the buyer will shech the animal, can he shech it in the meat market? Can he weigh it in a meat market? Or do we say, no, that's treating it too ordinarily. That's disrespecting the vestige of holiness in it. So the Mishnah says like this, that theoretically it should be a problem. But by all of the karbanos other than b'chayr and meiser behema, you see a b'chayr and a meiser behema, if and when they get blemished, as we just learned recently, they automatically become property either of the kohen or of the owner. It's never redeemed for money. It's never sold. However, all of the other karbanos that if they become blemished, thus they have to be redeemed. There is a purchaser that's going to buy it. The buyer will pay less money if the buyer will not be allowed to sell it properly in a meat market. Because if you can't sell it properly, if you have to do it not on the meat market, if you can't use a counterbalance, then the buyer is going to say, I might sell too much meat for too little money because if I can't use a proper balanced scale, and therefore from the outset, I'll pay to the Beis HaMikdash less money. So the Mishnah says that since Psulei HaMikdashim, the Hana'ah, if we would open up, if we would allow for these meats later to be sold properly, including using a proper scale balance, it's going to be sold for more money. Who's going to benefit? Hegdish. So therefore they allowed it to be sold on a weight. But the Bechar, but Meiser Sheni, that if they become blemished, they're not sold. They become property of the owners. Hegdish won't benefit by you allowing it to be sold the way mundane choil meat is sold. So no such dispensation was made. So after the Bechor becomes blemished and the Kohen can eat it, the Kohen can sell it, he may never sell it using a balance, but the Shoiklin money can egg money the Bechor, even though he can't use a proper scale, putting the meat on one balance and putting a counterweight on the other, but he can put meat on one side, meat on the other side. So the Gemara is saying, just like by the Bechor, where you may not sell the meat of a Bechor on a proper scale, but they allowed meat, the meat should be the counterweight to the meat, and that's a Stam Mishnah, that fits with what L'chayra, the same thing is when it comes to Yom Tov. You can't sell meat, a butcher, by putting it in a scale, uvda d'chayil, but yes, you will be allowed to do money, keneged money. It's enough of a deviation. That's a Gavaldic comparison, and Amalei Abaya, Lav Davke, Vilma Loihi. Maybe that Mishnah is not only following Rabbi Yeshua. That Mishnah can even be the Chachamim of Beitzah Daf Koyach. That by Yom Tov you can't use any scale, even putting something like a vessel on the other side. Because I will argue, Akan Loik Amar Rabbi Yeshua over here by Yom Tov that he is lenient. Even the Lekeh B'zoyin Kachim. We're not speaking about consecrated food, which should be treated with the utmost level of respect. All you need is to make a shino. You have to do a change from it being a mundane activity. So Rabbi Yeshua says not putting the weight in the counterbalance is enough. Somewhat over there, since there is bizoyim kachim, that's why it's going to be more problematic. You can compare notice Rabbi Yeshua might hold, that might not be Rabbi Yeshua, that you may not sell mana keneged mana by a bechar. And similarly in the reverse, inami. Hassan by the Bechar, that the Mishnah can be Chachamim. And the Chachamim allow for you, when you sell your blemished Bechar, you can use meat against meat. Because for when people sell meat in a sale, no butcher uses meat as the counterweight in a sale context. Since we're speaking about selling a Bechar, mana, keneged mana, is taka a perfect deviation, shinoi, change, thus allowed. But over here, what? What over here? In the story of Rab Chia and Rab Shem Rebbe, no one was buying and selling. They were two chaverim, a Talmud, a son. Their teacher gifted them meat, but they wanted to divide a gift equally. When it comes to dividing a gift equally, this is the way you do it. This is the way you do it, because you're not buying per kilo, you're not paying per pound. You don't need to know how many pounds. You just want to make sure that each party gets an equal share. The Mexico, again, that's the way people divide gifts. So maybe they would not allow it. In other words, you can't prove from the Mishnah Mechayvas that we paskin like Rabbi Yeshua. And now the Gemara B'chlal has a challenge. This whole story doesn't make sense because when Rebbe gifted his son and his student meat, it doesn't make sense that they would behave in a way that they're going to use a scale to make sure that everyone gets exactly the same amount. Ki'ilu, no one wanted to allow the other one to get more than them. Such types of precision was not in their nature. Remember the copy Adadi, were they that concerned for everyone to get exactly the same? I tell you another story. Hanu Shev Binisa. There were once 7 fishalach. There were 7 fishes. The Asilabei Rebbe that were given to the house of Rebbe. Rebbe passed it on to his son and to a student. And you know what happened at the end? Rab Chia ended up with 5, which means that Rab Shimon ben Rebbe only ended up with 2. And so the story doesn't fit. If there would have been meat to divide, they would have taken a knife, they would have cut it to what more or less looked like half and half, and that would have been good enough. They wouldn't have wasted their time weighing it. And indeed, we have the story wrong. Amar Papa, Shtei Gavra Binayo, you got to replace one person. It was not Rab Chia and Rab Shimon ben Rebbe. Either the story happened with Rab Chia and Rab Yishmael ben Rab Yosi, or the story happened with Rab Shimon ben Rebbe and Bar Kapara. And there they were makpid. And therefore, yes, the solution to make sure that everyone gets the same amount would have been by using this weight scale, but they didn't put a counterweight. They put 1/2 and 1/2, and they just made sure that both of them ultimately balanced out, each one receiving exactly like the other. Moving on to the next din of certain preliminary food preparations that may not be done in a way that you can call it uvda d'chayil, and that will be sharpening knives. And we're speaking here about the chalaf. Let's begin with that. Says the Mishnah, Ein mashchizin es asakin b'yamtiv. You may not sharpen the chalaf, and that will also go to the knives in the kitchen later on yamtiv. Now, don't forget, guys, sharpening a knife means the knife is good. You want to make it even better. And the reason why our Tana holds you may not do it, even though when it comes to oichel nefesh, food preparation, normally you can break what's otherwise a av, because our chachamim hold that's not called food preparation. This is called preliminary food preparation. It's the knife that you're using to cut the food. However, abol mashiyom or masiyah, you can scrape it al gaba chaverto. You can scrape one against the other, and we're going to have no less than 4 versions in understanding the Mishnah. Amar Afuna, version number 1, regarding the prohibition of sharpening a knife. Only if you're using a whetstone. Whoever is a shoichet here will understand what a whetstone is, and that really sharpens the knife. And therefore, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, you have to wet it the whole time. That's uvda d'chayil. That's mundane activity. That is what's not allowed. But if you have some sort of wooden board, which is ordinarily never used to sharpen a knife, then you can sharpen the knife. Now, even the Evan, when is it prohibited? That's only if you want to sharpen it. But all if you want us to remove the grease, the fats from the knife, then you are even allowed to use a stone. Says the Gemara, according to this version of the statement of Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Michlal, the B'Shalates, version number 1. Version number 2. Other people learned we're referring to Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel's statement that he said it on the seifa of the words of Rav Huna. When Rav Huna says B'Shalates, then you can use. So on that, Amar Shmuel, that was already a chumrah, the opposite direction.
I'm not understanding. Are you allowed to sharpen a knife or not? If you can sharpen it over the vils. Even if it's all within the chayil.
No. So but I think that the nakuda of everything we're learning today is that when the problem is only uvda the chayil, changing the way you normally do it will resolve it altogether.
But sometimes you can sharpen with a leather strap. You can sharpen on stone. You can take 2 knives and sharpen one against the other. Every butcher, every sheikhet has their way. A whetstone is one. So if you could sharpen a knife, sharpen it however you want, because you need it
for the audience. Samach is a big professional. Samach, let me ask you: did you ever sharpen a knife on wood? I want to know. Did you ever use wood?
Wood will not sharpen a knife ever.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're saying. So it won't properly sharpen the knife.
So, by the way, doing it that way is a sakana. A sharp knife is safer than a dull knife. But anyway,
it's not about safety. Okay, we're not speaking about safety. We're speaking about like this.
Right.
Like, this is the. If I may not do something because it's an av melacha or a tulda, a shinoi at best will take it down from a biblical violation to a rabbinic violation. If the problem to begin with is not biblical, it's only ubda d'chayil, then a shinoi will do all it needs to done. That's the nakuda. And we're learning exactly, there's nuances in the shinoi. So let's go back. According to the second version, that this which you said, that's only lahaber shamnu nisa. Now, with the greatest respect to Tzemach, Shmuel, according to this version, felt that wood could be used to sharpen. Yeah, you just have to know what you're doing. But to sharpen it, already yasser. And if that is the statement of Shmuel, then Michlal, Bishal Even, Afilu Lahaber Shamnu Nisa is also yasser. Version number 3, there's others who learned the statement of Ibn Shmuel directly on the Mishnah, not on Afuna. When it says in our Mishnah, you may not sharpen a knife on Yom on that. The problem is only sharpening it. But if the issue is only removing its fat, then it's mutter. Now this is a big leniency because that when the Mishnah said at the end using 2 knives, if there the Mishnah says you are allowed, you know what's going to mean? You can even sharpen a knife one against the other. And Tzemach is saying in his mind that that's the normal way to do it. Probably not. Probably the real correct way of doing it is using a stone. And if you do it a little bit different, it's already good enough of a shinu. So it's how much of a shinu do you have to do? Very similar to the first Mishnah we learned today. You're using a scale. How much of a shinu do you have to do? The Eked Masnilah, the fourth version is that Rav Yehuda, our Shmuel statement, was on the Sefer of our Mishnah. When it says Abel Masiel Gabe Chaverta, you can sharpen one knife against the other. On that, Amar Yehuda Shmuel, who Loi Shanu Ella, Lahabe Shamnu Nisa. This is Tzemach, you'll identify with this version. Using one knife against the other, if you're sharpening it, that's normal. If you're only removing the fat, then you can use it. Which would imply Michlal to the Mashchezes. If you're using a proper stone, whether it's a stone, whether it's wood, Afilu Lahavish Amnu Nisa Aser. It's all about, and one can argue, L'choida, it's all about Minig Hamakim. I'm saying this it's perhaps what you're familiar with. It's exactly why I'm just saying what Tzemach said in different words. The point is, you have to make a deviation. Whatever is in this locale, not the way you would deal with knives, that you can do on Yom Tov. If you're doing something that is ordinarily done, that may not be done. This is a concept of uvda d'chayil. I want to just say right now that throughout, up until today, in the halachic poskim, they have a big difficulty in defining and applying uvda d'chayil. It's very difficult to apply it. Like what is called uvda d'chayil, what's not called uvda d'chayil. The only way to properly do it is to get all of the cases throughout Shas of uvda d'chayil, to get the best picture you can get. But it's a challenge to know how to apply it in modern day things. I know that a scooter, when there's an Edu or on Yom Tov, up until recently, everyone called it Uvda d'chayil. Uvda d'chayil. I don't want to pass, I'm not a poisik. Many people de facto are using it. God forbid, no one is, not to say things that will make many people be violators. And people counter, why is that Uvda d'chayil? Like, how do you define Uvda d'chayil? It's difficult. Okay. And I'm just leaving the question open because the question is open unto Ad Hayoyim Hazeh by the biggest poskim. They debate, how do you apply Uvda d'chayil? Now the Gemara is making a very big statement, as we said in the Mishnah. This whole topic, the whole issue of you needing, right, to sharpen the knife in an unusual way or to remove the fats in an unusual way, that's only if you don't follow Rebbe Yehuda, Man Tana, that the Mashchezes, sharpening a knife is a problem, even though the knife is needed for food. So this is called a preliminary food need. Machshidei oichel nefesh. Amar Rab Chizda, our Mishnah is the like Rab Yehuda. And even though it says the Tanya, and we're going to have this quoted many times, remember it's a Mishnah, the Bach amends, It's a Mishnah that writes, Ein ben Yontiv l'Shabbos elo oichel nefesh bolvat. Otherwise, if it's not directly food related, then Yontiv is as chamur as Shabbos. Rebbe Yehuda Omer matir af machshirei oichel nefesh. And therefore, sharpening a knife is allowed, or as we'll learn soon, repairing a spit is allowed. Now, I want to say something very important. Even according to Rabbi Yehuda, when does Rabbi Yehuda allow for you to say, machshirei oichel nefesh, do whatever you need to do, if you are unable to do it prior to Yom Tov? Like, for example, if it's a chalaf knife, and it was not nicked prior to Yom Tov, a nick, for people that know shchita, if the knife has the smallest nick, it's not valid. If the shoichet did not sharpen it before Yom Tov, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, you should have done it before Yom Tov. Just like oichel nefesh itself, what did we learn? Shitas Rashi. If you could have done it and it would have been just as fresh before Yom Tov, you don't say, Yom Tov oichel nefesh. Machshirei oichel nefesh is not going to be better. When does Rabbi Yehuda allow for you to break even melachos for machshirei oichel nefesh if you could not have done it before? That's very important. This statement is important to understand the next Gemara. Says the Gemara, 3 lines from the bottom. I want you to know that Darshina Nishmecha, that I heard people quoting you Rav Chizda, that you paskin like Rav Yehuda, MS, Chiddush, because normally Yachid Rabim, Halacha Kerabim. And Rav Chizda said, Yehei Rava, may it be God's will, that whenever something good is said, it should be said in my name. In other words, I did not say it, but I so agree with it, I'm happy that they quoted me. Omar Rav Nachem Yeberei Rav Yosef. I want you to know a story. I was standing in front of Rava on Yom Tov, and what did I observe? Rava v'hava kol daf chav ches amid beis on the top. V'hava kol ma'avir l'sakina apuma didikula. Rava was rubbing the knife on the edge of a wooden basket. Now you have to go back and remember, he did something that according to some of the versions above, if his intent was to sharpen it, according to the Chachamim, it will not be allowed. Only with Rabbi Yehuda it would be allowed. And therefore, to clarify, I asked him, are you rubbing it? Are you rubbing it against the edge of the wooden basket to sharpen it, or only lahaver shamnu nisa, which according to one of the versions above, even lachachamim is allowed? And the Omar Li Rava responded, only lahaver shamnu nisa. In other words, Rava was saying that I'm not following Rabbi Yehuda. However, who is the Amoira, but says Rav Nechemia, I knew the emes. The chazisi l'daitai, I saw from the way he was rubbing it, I saw his intention that really he was sharpening it. And I understand why he didn't tell me that he's sharpening it, because Savar, evidently, Rava holds halacha ve'ein moiden kain. Now, this is a phenomenal concept. Normally, who paskin, who the halacha is like. And you should know that there are times that the halacha follows A, but ve'ein moiden. Ve'ein moiden means that when you're learning in the yeshiva, you can say that in that scenario, we follow Rabbi Yehuda. In our case, even machshirei oichel nefesh is doiche Yom Tov if you could not have done it before Yom Tov. If anyone is asking you a shiur, or even in our case, Rav Nechemia, right? Rav Nechemia wasn't asking him a shiur. Rav Nechemia was observing the Rava doing something, and he was asking him, "What are you doing?" That's also called a shiur. Halacha ve'ein moiden kain means that the Rava felt he's not allowed to say, I'm following Rabbi Yehuda. Now, ein moiden kain, Rashi writes, second line from the top, that halachic Rabbi Yehuda, look inside the second line in Rashi, umuter kolish lasois, avul ein moiden l'rabin kain. But if you're giving a tzadin in the public, you may not say it.
But if this is halacha, why and more came? If this is the halacha,
I'll explain. Wait. Before we get to Yakir, the Alter Rebbe from this Gemara says that even though Rashi says l'rabim, Rashi doesn't mean only l'rabim, but yes l'yachid. Rashi means in public, but he means even to a yachid, because this was a conversation between Rava and Rav Nechemiah. There was no rabbin. Now, why a moedin came, says Rashi, because Rabbi Yehuda only allows for you to do things, even though it's only machshirei oichel nefesh, if you were unable to do it before Yom Tov. That chilik, most people won't remember. Most people, once they hear, machshirei oichel nefesh is like oichel nefesh, they're going to end up sharpening knives, even if they were able to sharpen it before Yom Tov. So we are afraid, Yakir, that people won't apply the heter narrowly, like Rabbi Yehuda only applies it narrowly. They're going to broaden it. So what do? That's what you do. When people learn together Gemara, not like this. You tell everyone, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. And in the learning, they were learning. So in the learning, we keep on saying, we're going to say again and again, Rabbi Yehuda only allows you machshirei oichel nefesh if the knife was good before Yom Tov. It became dull on Yom Tov. It got nicked on Yom Tov. In learning, when a person comes with the shaila, people, can I use this knife, Rabbi? Can I sharpen it? You tell them no. Yakir is very unhappy. All right.
I don't appreciate that they don't tell people to begin. Whatever, yeah, all good.
No, okay, so I want to differently. There's certain things
we can understand that.
You tell people when they're learning together. People are not making the effort to learn the sugya, then to make sure they don't misapply a ruling, you have to be more stringent. Okay, let's go back. Even to a yachid, says the Alter Rebbe from our Gemara. Another story number 2. Ve'amar Abaye. I was standing in front of my master. Now we know who raised Abaye. Who raised Abaye was Rabba. So normally you should know, whenever Abaye says, my master, it's Rabba, the Rashba had a girsa that here it's Rabbi Yosef. So whether it was with Rabba, whether it was with Rabbi Yosef, and the same thing. Here it's more. Here he saw Amar, his master, rubbing the knife on the edge of a millstone. Now again, we have to go back to Amadalov, all the different versions. A millstone is a stone, right? That's already more problematic. And again, and I asked him, are you rubbing it because you want to sharpen it on a stone? And that would only be according to Rabbi Yehuda, no matter what version you have. Only that we learned one of the Ikadamres, that even Lachachamim that will be allowed. And Ba'amar Li, same thing. I'm only trying to get rid of the grease. And again, but I saw it's happening. I understood from what he was doing, his intention, that really the Lachadot Ka'avit, I didn't challenge him. I understood the reason why he responded to me only Lahav Shamnu Nisa, because he also, like Rabba holds, Halacha ve'ein moedin kain. Okay, and now we're moving on. In Masechtas Chulin, we learn that to show kavod to a Rav, a Sheikhet should show the Rav his knife. For the Rav to go ahead and make a bedika, as we make a bedika, by going over the edge at least 6 times, you go up and down in the center, you go up and down on one side, you go up and down on the other side. We're just speaking about on the sides of the blade, in order to see whether there's, God forbid, a nick, which would render the animal treifa, or whether it's as it should be, without nicks at all. Now, question is, says the Gemara, that they asked in the yeshiva, are you allowed to show it? Now imagine showing a knife to the Rav on Yom Tov. Again, Rashi writes. Again, it's like people only use the knives when it comes to shechting meat, when it comes to selling meat. It's normally connected to commerce, and you're doing this in public, and it's uvda d'chayil, or not. That's the question. So the machlokes. Rav Mani B'nei Rav Bizna says, yeah, allowed, and the Rabbanan Asri says, Rav Yosef, let me tell you how to do it. The only problem is because it's being done in public, and until today, there are many activities that are not allowed in public. They're considered uvda d'chayil in public. Many people paskin that playing ball, in public is usher, in private is okay. From this, so do it in private. So what should you do? Talmud Chacham Roya La'atzmai, someone who we can all trust knows how to examine knives, should do it in the privacy of his house. It's not being done in public, and then he can lend his knife to other people. That will be a way of doing a bedika, not doing it in public, and you're covering everyone's opinion. Ve'amar Rabbi Yosef. Now, sakin sha'amda. Amda means a knife that became dull. A knife that became dull. In other words, as we just learned, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, if it developed a nick, if it was you couldn't work with it from before Yom Tov, you cannot fix it. You cannot fix it. At least not in the ordinary way. But here it's dull. So says Rabbi Yosef, according to Rabbi Yehuda, because you don't expect a person, don't mean it was working. And every time you use it, it gets more dull and more dull and more dull. That's not something that you could have done from before Yom Tov. But the Hanamili, who the Paska Agav Ducha, but when are you still allowed to fix it according to Rabbi Yehuda? When it's still functional. When it's still functional. In other words, it's dull, you can cut, but you have to put a lot of pressure. But what happens if it's so dull and you can't even use it? So you can't say, you're Misakim Keli. You know why not? Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, Machshiri Eichel Nefesh is Doiche Yom Tov. So now we're introducing something called, Rashi writes, Tircha Yiseidam. Too much extraneous tircha, too much work. In other words, how much schwitzing do you need to do to get the knife functional? If it's dull but still usable, you're allowed to fix it. But it's relatively quick. Something that demands a lot of work, that in itself is not allowed. Again, how do we apply this is very difficult. Weiter. Or V'itayim Rabbi Yosef. Echad sakin shenifgamo. That if a knife became nicked on Yom Tov, or a shaput or a spit shenirtzam, that the tip was cut off or broke off on Yom Tov, or on Yom Tov, the echad girifas tana v'keraim, and clearing out, shoveling out the different types of ovens and the double stovetops. These are all activities that you could not have done beforehand, and they make that utensil needed for food ready, usable. And again, it's a Mishnah. Not oichel nefesh, even machshirei oichel nefesh is not doiche Yom Tov. However, Rabbi Yehuda matir af machshirei oichel nefesh. Now, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda never differentiates between something that could have been done before Yom Tov, which may not be done, versus something we didn't expect you to do before Yom Tov, which may be done. How do we get to that differentiation? So now let's go into the underlining machlokes. And I want to go back to Yakir. Maybe that's also why halacha ve'ein moedin came. In other words, if Rabbi Yehuda himself would have said those words, maybe we would have passed like Rabbi Yehuda. But maybe we were afraid that not enough people know that chiluk li Rabbi Yehuda between something that could have been done before versus not. There was a fear, so they did not pass like him in public or to a yachid if it's halacha l'mais. Now, my time at the Tanach, all of this is based on the pasuk in Boy regarding Pesach Yom Tov, where the Torah says, "Ach asher yei ochel l'chol nefesh," and here we continue, "Hu levadoy yei asolachem." Who means that alone may be done for you. So if you focus on the word that it's an exclusionary word. Chachamim v'lo machshira. Food, not even preliminary. Rabbi Yehuda says the word lachem is extra, and the word lachem is an inclusive word. Lachem v'chol tzarchechem, all of your needs, even preliminary needs. The Tanakh it says lachem. So Amalach, as we learned above, hahu, that the heter of oichel nefesh is only food being made for Jews, lachem, and not for non-Yidden. The idach nami, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it says who. So Amalach says Rabbi Yehuda, you're right. It says who, exclusionary. It says lachem, inclusionary. The loy kasher, Rabbi Yehuda now explains. Kan v'machshirin she'efshir lasoisim me'erev Yom Tov. Here I apply the word who, and that may not be done on Yom Tov. When do I allow it? Only the machshirin sheyev shel asreisem me'erev Yom Tov. Weiter, Omar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. I want you to know that a shaput shenirsaf, a spit that became bent on Yom Tov, bent means it's functional, it's just bent. You would rather it to be straight like a lulav, but it's still functional. Says Shmuel, Asur l'saknoi b'Yom Tov, you may not correct it. Not connected to Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Another very difficult concept to apply, and that's called tircha deloy tzarech. It's not a excessive amount of work. It's relatively easy to straighten it out, but you don't even need it. Why do you care if the spit is a little bit bent? Garnish, the food will taste the same. So an exertion, not because of it being a big exertion, but because it's a not necessary. An unnecessary exertion may not be done on Yom Tov. I think Gemara says pshita. The Gemara says no, it's not pshita. It's needed because afal gad the nifshid biyadei. Even with your hands, you can straighten it out. In other words, you need a minimum amount of tircha. Very little tircha is needed to fix it. You may not fix it. Finally, once you used a spit for meat, guys, we have to add the words that goes in the Ramah, and you don't plan to use it again. That's key. You don't plan to use it again. This spit now becomes a little bit repulsive because of the residue of fats and of meats that remains on that spit. It renders it muksa. Also, taltal b'yantiv. And the Ramah says, if you need to use it again, you are allowed to handle muksa for food preparation. But if you don't plan to use it again, once it's used, once the chicken goes off that spit, then the spit, because of it being repulsive, is muksa. And now, what do you do with it right now? So, Omar Rav Ada bar Ahava, Omar Rav Malkiyoi. Now there's an Amoyda Malkiyoi.
What's the meaning letaltelo biyonto? To carry? No.
You can't move it. You can't handle it. You for sure cannot carry it in the normal way, Yakin. In the normal way. Muksa. Any kitchen utensil, people, you can't say, it's for food. If you don't plan to eat from this, if you're not using it on Yom Tov and it's repulsive, then it becomes muksa. Now, what do you do with it? You don't have to leave it on your dining room table. So, Rav Ada bar Ahava says in the name of Malkiyoi, two things are needed to resolve the muksa. Number one, shoimtoi. Number one is you move it in an unusual way. And number two, you only move it the minimum amount needed to get it out of the way. That's very important. In other words, Rashi explains, tiltul min atzad, take it in an unusual way. Now, we learned many opinions that say that once muksa is in your hand, you can put it down wherever you want. This Rav Malki was very machmir. Not only do you have to pick it up in an unusual way, but you don't have now a green card to go carry it around to wherever you want. Put it in the corner and leave it. However, Rab Chia bar Ashi Omar Afuna, and he adds a bigger chumrah. Even that is only allowed if there is a kazayas basar. So at least there's some food on it. So you can argue that you are also moving food. If there is no food on it, now this is according to this very chomer opinion in the name of Rafuna, then you may not even move it indirectly. I want you to know that's a very big chumrah, and the reason why we are more machmir here than in other muksas is because people don't realize that it's muksa. So you have to lean on the chomer side. Many people feel all the utensils in the kitchen for food, it's good to go. It's not good to go. If you're going to use them, it's good to go. If you want to clean them to use them again, you're good. But if you don't plan to use them, look like pashut. So they were very machmir. Now Ravina said the opposite. Ravina was very lenient. He said, even if there's not an ounce of meat on it, not only can you move it, you can move it directly, without a shinui. Why? Because a spit is sharp, and there is a danger aspect. And can you imagine if there is a thorn out there in the street? Moving something in the Reshus Harabim, Daladamas or more, is an Isser Do'iraisa. Says Ravina, and everyone agrees with that if there is a hazard, the Reshus Harabim on Shabbos, Move it pachus midaladamas. Why? Because people might get hurt. So if you can move a thorn pachus midaladamas where you might violate an isur doiraisa, the problem is muksa. We're not minimizing muksa, but muksa is a darabanan. It's a very big darabanan, but it's a darabanan. I don't need to move it kala achayad. A spit, anything sharp, you can move around freely. Amar Rab Chinana berei de Rab Ika. That's Rab Chinana's version. That being that there were two Amoraim whose names were very similar, Malkiyoi, that's Yud Vav, with Achoilam, who we just quoted, and Malkiyah, who did not opine over here, but he gave other statements, in order to make sure that we don't forget who said what, throughout Shas, this statement is repeated a few times. So you should know that the law of the shapud, of the spit, that we just learned, Rav Malkiyoy was the one that was relatively very machmer. You have to have a kazayis basar, even though he didn't say it. Rav Kia said it. But you can only move it in tiltul kaleachayad. You can only move it into the corner. The law regarding shevachais. Now shevachais, Rashi reminds us, the first line under the Gemara, there's a machlekes and ksubais regarding the responsibilities that a man has towards his wife, the responsibilities that a wife has towards her husband. And the Mishnah there speaks about a woman who brought in as a dowry many shvachais, there's a lot of help in the house. And the Chachamim therefore saying that almost all of her responsibilities, she becomes exempt from it because her helpers can do it. Rabbi Eliezer, without getting into the details, is based on a premise that if a person has too much free time on their hands, they're going to get into mischief, they're going to get into trouble. So Rabbi Eliezer is machman, and he holds that even if she brings in 1,000 maidservants, there are more responsibilities that she will still have to do. So the law of shvachos, paskening like Rabbi Eliezer, that also came from Malkiyoi. And the third one is gumais. Gumais, Rashi reminds us, how do we determine whether someone becomes a halachic adult? So it's age, but really it's not only age, but it's also body maturity. And that is if two pubic hairs are growing. Now, what happens if you don't see the hair, but you see the guma, you see the pore from which normally a hair is grown? So can you say that since there are the gumais, it means that there was a sa'ara? And yes, and all of that was said by Malkiyoi and the law of Shapud, which was a chumrah, the law of Shavachais that we pass like Rabbi Eliezer l'chumrah, the law of Gumais l'kula or l'chumrah because it makes the person into an adult, that was said by Malkiyoi. And the other three halachais, which is the law of a beluris means literally a lock of hair. The goyim, until today, in many cultures, they associate their haircut with their avodah zarah god. Like, for example, you go to the Far East, many people have a certain type of ponytail that they leave in the back of their heads. They shave all of the hair, and they have one paya sticking out. And that is done l'shem avodah zarah. Question is, if the Jew is a barber, is he allowed to give such a haircut? And the answer is no. And when he comes 3 finger breadths near that hair that's let to grow for the avodah zarah, he already cannot shave it all the way up until there. In other words, there are restrictions on a yid cutting the hair for someone who has a avodah zarah type of haircut. Many people, the mecheda that I went to, they applied bloodies to any chup and then oigaval. But let's go back. Efer mikla, ashes. What's the law of ashes? That if a person has a cut, where's the doctor? One of the ways that you would prevent infection is by having it heal quicker, and they would put ashes. Problem with ashes is that ashes goes into the wound, goes into the skin, and after it heals, there is a tinge of black in the skin, and that looks like a tattoo. Making a tattoo is also midaraisa. So the Rav Malkiyah paskin that you may not use efer mikla to heal a wound. And number 3, the law of cheese. Now, when the Chazal said that cholov, that you did not have a Yisrael oimed al gabav, there wasn't a Jew there, is cholov akum. So initially, that was only a din regarding milk and not regarding cheese, because milk only curdles if it's from a kosher animal. So theoretically, if it's cheese, if it's gavina, I do not need it for it to come from cholov Yisrael. But Malkiyah was machmed. Why? Because he held that even though the cheese itself came for sure from kosher milk, but the minig was to smear, or in English, to smear the outer part of the cheese to make it look attractive with different fats. And fats from non-kosher animals at times were used, and therefore even Gevina has to have an action. That was said by Malkiah. So that's the siman. Rav Papa argues with Rav Chanina, and he says no, that all of Masnisa and Masnisa, everything that we quoted above, that's coming either from a Mishnah and a Beitzah, that was said by Malkiah. All of the other statements that come from a Shemaitza, from the Amoraim, all of that is in the name of Malkiah. And the Simonech, to remember Rav Papa, it's simple. Masnis and Malkasa, that's a statement that we have in the Zohar, that the Mishnah and the Beitzah is considered the queen in comparison to the scripture, which is considered the king. And Malkiah, which means queen, he was the one that gave the rulings regarding Masnisa and Masnisa. Now the Gemara says, what will be the difference? So the Gemara mentions one difference and Tosfos adds another one. The difference will be the case of Shvachos. You see, Shvachos is a Mishnah. So according to Rav Chinana's version, it was Rav Malkiah that ruled like Rabbi Eliezer. No, but according to Rav Papa, no. If it's about a paskening like something that's brought down in the Mishnah, which is also Shvachos, that was said by Malkiah. And then Tosfos adds, and the same thing will be regarding Efer Mikla. Efer Mikla is not mentioned anywhere, is not mentioned in a Mishnah. So who has Efer Mikla? Efer Mikla was Malki. According to Rav Chinana, Efer Mikla was said by Malkiah. And according to Rav Papa, no, I take it back. Efer Mikla is also a Mishnah. So you have to change Shvachos and Efer Mikla. That's the machlokes as to who said what. So how beautiful is it that when we're making an effort to remember who said what, we have a machlokes as to who said what. And God willing, Chevra, to be continued. So the next time we'll learn together will be, God willing, Sunday morning, the normal 6 o'clock, and God will learn Chavtes and Lamed.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos.